Hello and welcome back to another edition of our scratch build of this two-seat radio-controlled Spitfire. As ever, please like and subscribe to support the channel, and please press the bell icon for notifications when we put new content on the channel. Now, when we left last time, we were just joining the wings, and here they are all cured, and we've now added and carved to shape, using a sanding block and a razor plane, the wingtips. And progress is looking really good. Hopefully by the end of this episode we'll be able to put the major components of this airframe together and have a look as to what it's going to look like. We'll make a start in just a moment, but first I'd just like to mention the canopies. And I don't personally have a vacuum forming machine, so I reached out to a firm called Vortex Vac Forms and I sent them the plugs to do the vacuum formings from, and they've supplied these beautiful vacuum moulded canopies, and they're lovely and crystal clear in PETG. We'll get those cut to shape and fitted, and we can have a look what they look like too. We're going to start this episode by the fitment of the tailplane assembly that we made in a previous episode. And I've marked here the hole that we're going to cut out of the fiberglass fuselage moulding that we made back in episode 2. But we have to be careful here that we don't paint ourselves into a corner. And what I mean by that is, when we assemble these various bits, there'll be a specific order in which we put it all together so that we can still get the joiner through the tailplane and then epoxy the hinges in and such. And I also need to know that there will be enough space either to put a horn on this wire joiner here internally with silver solder, say made out of brass or something, or whether to make the pushrod come out through the side of the fuselage underneath the tailplane in the conventional manner and have a horn on the bottom of the elevator.
Let's start by chain drilling to remove this area and make a hole. Then we can tidy that hole up using a sanding drum in the Dremel. To get into this leading edge area though, we will need a smaller diameter cutter. It's important to be careful here to maintain the tailplane incidence and keep the tailplane perpendicular to the fin. We'll keep checking the fit regularly, as it's easier to remove material than it is to add it back. I do have some much smaller files than this, although this requires quite a big adjustment. Looking at this, there might just be space for an internal elevator linkage, provided that we fit it before the tailplane or the stern post.
So here I've made up a push rod from a lightweight piece of carbon fibre tubing, and I've soldered a brass horn onto our elevator joiner, and I've put a little bit of threaded bar, and that's bound with thread and epoxy onto the carbon fibre tube, and I've put a little tiny drop of very weak purple thread lock on the end of here so it doesn't just unscrew on its own. And but it still gives us some adjustment by twisting this when it's in the aircraft if we need to adjust the length of the push rod. But if it came unscrewed, we'd find it very difficult to put it back in, I think. Firstly, we need to squirm this into the aeroplane then.
I had to cut a small notch in the back of the tailplane to clear the elevator horn. Sliding the tailplane into position and checking for alignment before we add any glue. The glue I use is this Loctite High-Sol, as it's designed specifically for gluing things to fiberglass fuselages like this. Now, while all that sets and it is a very slow cure, we're going to move to the other end, to the nose, to fit the firewall. And the advantage of starting from a 3D drawing means we can take sections to make accurate bulkheads that fit the inside of the fuselage. I made this template with a spacer from a couple of thicknesses of thin card to set the position and alignment of the firewall. We only need it fastened to the motor and propeller driver assembly whilst we tack the firewall into position with CA glue. Then we can carefully remove the motor and apply a fillet of the Loctite high salt epoxy glue in front and behind the firewall to lock it into position. And again we'll use the self-mixing nozzle. Whilst all that lot sets, let's get some bits and bobs finished. Let's cover the wings with 20 grams per square metre fiberglass and resin before they get full of dents. This is much like covering with tissue and dope, using the minimum amount of resin just to wet the cloth out. The excess will be sanded off later. Let's mark and fit the stern post with a notch to clear the elevator pushrod. I made this cutout to accept a tongue made out of lolly sticks. And now's a good time to fit this while we have access to the inside of the cowling. Magnets will secure the rear of the cowling. And while we're getting bits and bobs done, let's mark and trim these canopies to size. Let's make up some aileron control horns, and these are made from some carbon fibre salvaged from some old helicopter side frames. Now that the firewall is set, let's convert some of these fuselage frames into files we can cut on the laser in the same way as we did all the other parts. Once again, the order in which we assemble these inside the fuselage is critical, as some of these parts will block access to other ones. At least the fuselage moulding is slightly transparent at this stage, so at least we can see what we're doing and we can make sure the frames go in nice and straight.
So with those plywood frames cut, we're ready to put them inside the plane. And this main one here, I've added these two stiffeners with epoxy, and these are now really stiff. You've noticed I've fretted most of it away as well to keep the weight down. My concern was that because the cowling comes off here and most of the upper fuselage is cut away, remember this is a belly lander, that perhaps in a less than perfect arrival maybe the fuselage would crease and split like this. And so this component will keep the fuselage nice and stiff, and it will also house the battery, the servos and perhaps the speed controller. Right, let's wriggle this inside the plane.
Once again, we're going to use the high salt epoxy and a self-mixing nozzle to fix these frames into position. These self-mixing nozzles are amazing, and I don't know how I would have done the job without them.
Whilst all that cures, I've decided to pop all the bits together so we can have a look at her. And this is how she's going to look, of course, when she's all finished. I've just balanced the canopies into position and also the wings. We'll sort out the wing mounting arrangement perhaps in the next episode. But for now we get a good idea of our progress. I hope you're enjoying this series of our two-seat scratch-built radio controlled Spitfire build. Thanks for watching and join us next time.